it's a very interesting website that the rest of you could also go and take a look at. So, not taking any more time, I will leave the floor to you.
Okay.
Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for inviting me here. Thank you to Ilda, Andrew and Lennart in particular for arranging my travel and getting me here on time in the right place. Just a couple of things I'm going to say before I go into the lecture as you raised them. Cities at Manchester is an initiative at the university. It brings together architects, planners, anthropologists, engineers, anybody who basically has an interest in some aspect of urbanism. And we try and get them, create spaces where they come together and talk about their ideas. And we also try and serve as a vehicle to working with non-academic stakeholders, wherever they are in the world, wherever cities are interested in. So NGOs, housing associations. We've got a website, Twitter, Facebook, and essentially it's a vehicle for trying to present a story about the work that's being done at Manchester with colleagues elsewhere in the world. And the other, Ilda made the point about this Urban Imagining Futures programme, just came out of me and a PhD student who actually visited here before called Ian Cook, just working together and realising that there was a group of people working on these issues. And actually what we've tried to do, most of them are graduate students of mine or others, for the first time we've actually tried to write something together, which actually been intellectually quite an experiment. People working roughly in the same area, trying to produce a joint statement, if you like. And actually probably as much work has gone into talking about what doesn't go into the paper as what goes into it. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to record myself today, as I've been told by my university this is the thing to do. I know you're going to record me as well. So let me just see it. Okay, so thank you for inviting me here today. I'm going to talk for 40 or 45 minutes. I have a tendency to get a little bit excitable at times, which means I tend to talk quite quickly. So people whose first language is English sometimes struggle to understand me. So I'm going to try and slow down. If I'm being patronising, put your hand up or try and get me to move along more quickly. So this is going to be the structure of my talk. As Ilda said, there are a series of debates and discussions that are going on in human geography, but increasingly in anthropology, political science, sociology, planning and architecture, actually often drawing upon existing literatures, particularly in, I would argue, architecture and planning, where there's a long history to people going from one place to another and learning how things happen or get done and then coming back and changing what they do. And so I've worked with a couple of historians recently looking at how planners in Britain went to Russia and learned about the Russian planning in the 1950s, and then the Russian planners came to Britain in the 1950s as part of an exchange and then took those ideas back. I'm not going to talk about that today, but just generally that's the context. So this is going to be the introduction to this is my structure of my talk. So the talk today starts in Edinburgh in Scotland, on this chunk of land. Who's been to Edinburgh in Scotland? Hands up. Okay, reasonable. Most of you won't have been to where I'm going to talk about, because where I'm going to talk about is a place called Leith, which is its waterfront. So most people, including me, if you're a tourist going to Edinburgh, will stay in and around the centre, okay, where you see the museums and the history, the castles, etc. I'm going to start my talk by talking a bit about this area, which is on the outskirts. So faced with a deindustrialising waterfront at the edge of the city, led by the local city government, but in partnership with a number of private, public and third sector agencies, has developed a number of redevelopment strategies over the years. So this is a kind of classic story of a waterfront in decline through a range of processes, containerisation, deindustrialisation, etc., facing a series of challenges about what you do with this chunk of land. Here's a couple of bits from the local newspaper. So Port turns over a new Leith. That's a horrible English joke about Leith being spelt wrong, as in Leith the area, rather than L-E-A-F, which is how English spell Leith. They attracted widespread local media attention, not a surprise. Other cities have experienced similar processes of economic and social dislocation, and they've often come up against similar challenges. So grand master plans and vision statements were launched in the 70s and the 1980s amongst a lot of razzmatazz, and actually didn't achieve much. And so this second point here is Sunshines on La Costa del Forth, again from the late 1990s, is a play on that part of Spain where people in England like to go and Scotland like to go in their holidays. There were, however, a couple of notable successes at this time. Part of the Scottish government relocated there in the mid-1990s. That did a couple of things. It increased the numbers employed in the area. And it also meant people were moving back and forth between the city of Edinburgh and the waterfront, which kind of brought it into the wider kind of imaginary of those who live in Edinburgh. And also a large retail complex opened up in the waterfront at the beginning of the 2000s, again creating jobs, but also involving that part of the Edinburgh economy in the wider kind of spatial economy. And also it did another thing, which it secured its waterfront in a place in what David Harvey refers to as the spatial division of consumption. So there were piecemeal residential developments over the course of the 2000s. But the view of local city government and other local, national and international stakeholders was that the waterfront was still in need of redevelopment. Its potential had not yet been realised. A new round of master plans and what were known locally as area development frameworks began in the 2000s. There were some consultation with local communities, but that again was piecemeal and not unproblematic. And I'm not really going to talk about that, but I'm happy to talk a bit about the ways in which certain people in the community were brought forward and others were pushed back in the consultation process. So there was a discussion amongst the different stakeholders about what it would take to redevelop in any kind of systematic way that area of the waterfront. This was a discussion that took a particular focus with the economic downturn and the financial crisis in the 2007-2008. And it was at that point that a number of stakeholders, led by local city government, began to explore the potential of using a particular model of financing infrastructure, about how to kickstart that bit of waterfront redevelopment. I'm going to talk a little bit about that model and how it's travelled, speaking to a range of debates that we're all interested in, I guess. So I want to talk a bit about something called tax increment financing. And that's a model that's been used widely in the US and has begun to travel outside the US. Its primary attraction in terms of location was first in Chicago. Edinburgh City Council's interest in TIF involved comparing the city, Edinburgh, with others elsewhere that had used TIF, as well as exploring how the policy cum model had travelled from one location to another, and the changes that it might need to undergo in the context of the UK's financial, governmental and legal system. So here the urban politics over the financing of the future of the waterfront stretched beyond the physical extent of the city. Rather, the urban was being made sense of, assembled and constituted in and through a series of distantiated relations, geographically discrete, but relationally proximate sites. Through various channels, circulations and connections, and their territorial expressions, elements of calculation, expertise, information, knowledge and modelling were brought together as a means of Edinburgh and its city government and a number of other stakeholders reaching a kind of outcome in terms of thinking about how they might redevelop the waterfront. The need to uncover the ways in which urban politics of various sorts draw together elements of elsewhere has generated a significant degree of academic interest in recent years. The increasingly complex spatiality of 21st century urban forms would appear to challenge a number of existing theories and methods, particularly those of the former that emerged out of the dominant canon of North American urban studies. While the long-standing tradition of comparison within this body of work remains immensely useful, it has been the subject to recent critique around the apparent disjuncture between its origins and the assumptions that go with it, on the one hand, and the trends in contemporary urbanisation on the other. So one strand of critique claims that were it ever appropriate to define all cities against a norm of form and function generated out of a particular country's set of urban experiences, this time appears to have passed. Instead, what is demanded is a more cosmopolitan and imaginative approach that moves beyond the othering of a large number of cities around the world, particularly those in the global south, implicit in many past comparative urban studies. And this is a wonderful point that Jenny Robinson has been making probably for the last 15 years and continues to make very eloquently. This is one element to a wider intellectual cum political project over the production of new geographies of theory and theorising. A second strand of critique focused more squarely on reconfiguring the ontologies of city-to-city comparison in light of the ever-changing relations between city and global processes. That is, the place of the city in the world and the world in the city. And here we can think about the work that's been done by Ananya Roy and Anya Ong in terms of worlding. Here the emphasis on comparing cities in the context of the location of cities in a myriad of connections, networks and webs. Advancing a theorisation that is sensitive equally to the role of relational and territorial geographies, of flow of fixity, of global context and place specificities, of structural imperatives and embodied practices, in the productions. And that seems to be a challenge. So this lecture, I think, is concerned with the second strand, which is great because actually I'm guessing Jennifer will concentrate most on the first. She may not, but I'm guessing. So this focuses on the ontologies of city-to-city comparison in light of the ever-changing relationships between cities and global processes and what it might mean methodologically. What Jane Jacobs distills as a prosaic, ongoing, but highly influential comparisons that occur amongst city dwellers and city builders alike. For while a series of empirical case studies in the areas of creativity, drugs, economic development, infrastructure planning, sustainability and transport have contributed to a wider theoretical rethinking of what is meant by international, planetary or global urban studies, some of the methodological challenges this work poses remain only tentatively explored. So it builds upon the methodological insights of traditional comparative urban studies, but doing so in light of the more recent work on relational comparisons. And here I'm drawing strongly on the work of Gillian Hart. So I would argue this involves a rethinking of the comparative frame. It asks how policy actors circulate policies amongst cities, how they draw on circulating policy knowledge, and how they put these engagements and encounters to use as they assemble their own urban policies and by extension play a role in shaping the futures of their own cities. And it draws upon field work in a number of different contexts. And I guess my example of tax increment financing, and I'm going to say a little bit about it, is actually about using that example about the ways in which city governments are having to think more experimentally and innovatively about financing infrastructure. In a number of different national contexts, city governments are having to think differently about how they generate the money that's then used to finance bits of infrastructure. From big infrastructure like waterfronts to small things like potholes and bits of water supply or whatever else it is. So quite incremental small things right up to big things. There's an increasing evidence there are models that are circulating that allow these sorts of decisions to be made. Okay. So what does it mean to imagine or think comparatively about cities in the 21st century? So during the 1990s, Jan Nijman has argued that comparative methodologies largely disappeared from view. But if that's the case, then the 2000s have seen a veritable renaissance, including Colin McFarlane's point, allowing Colin to argue that we may indeed be witnessing the beginning of an upsurge in comparative urban research that is global in scope. Now, Colin made that point in 2010. He probably wrote it in 2008, 2009. I'm sure if I came back to him now, 7, 8, 9 years later, I think he would be quite happy with his point. I think it's fair to say that we have seen an upsurge in thinking about cities comparatively. That said, there's a long intellectual history to comparing cities in the arts and the social sciences. So there's a whole series of urban anthropological studies during the 40s and 1950s, which were comparative and avoided seeking to universalise on the basis of a relatively small number of cases. Subsequent decades saw urban studies divided, this is quoting Jennifer, by the hierarchical categorisation of different kinds of cities as developed or undeveloped. And this shift reflected wider trends in social and urban theorisation as a particular form of scientific method emerged as dominant. And here Chris Pickvance, arguing almost 30 years ago, that the 1970s was a period of grand theory when theoretically driven models, which at best corresponded to realities in one country, were advanced as having general applicability. Comparative analysis is a necessary complement to such theorisation since it gives priority to testing the models over its whole scope of application. Let me whiz through. So this is the context in which I think we're rethinking the notion of comparison, and I've just highlighted 4 kind of key bullet points. So one is, I've made an argument, Colin McFarlane, Jennifer Robbins and others have made this argument about the potential for revisiting understandings of comparison. So what do we mean by comparison? I'm going to go and talk a bit more about this. A second kind of key trend in this work is the emergence of what we might think as relational urban geographical scholarship. That is thinking about the way we understand space and the way we understand cities in the context of networks and relationships that are often about geographical reach rather than terms such as geographical scale. A third aspect to this wider debate is the interurban referencing, or mobile urbanism, or what Colin McFarlane talks travelling urbanism. So this sense that cities are involved in a matrix through which they are referencing one another's activities and behaviours. And underpinning that is often consultants or think tanks or NGOs of different geographical reach who are playing a role in shaping the kind of ways in which cities, and sometimes their residents, imagine their futures. And then I guess the last point is the rethinking of the field in urban studies. So I'm a human geographer. Human geographers tend to have thought about the field in a particular kind of way. I don't think we have the same kind of relationship that maybe anthropologists do with the field, but nevertheless we do still think about the field, often as a bounded geographical space, the city, the village, the neighbourhood. Increasingly in bits of anthropology, particularly in geography, and those people who kind of bridge the two in terms of thinking about ethnographies, there is that sense about rethinking the field. And so one of the theoretical challenges that's thrown up, but it's also a methodological one, is about where you think the field stops and starts when you're doing this kind of work. And my own research has taken me into different kinds of places that maybe if I was thinking about studying the waterfront in Edinburgh 20 years ago, I wouldn't have found myself going to those places or engaging with documents that are produced from elsewhere. That's not to say there's still not part of the story that's about Edinburgh. There is, and there's still some importance in doing fieldwork in those places. Mine is Edinburgh, but it could easily be Stockholm. But the point is, there's actually a part of the story that maybe traditionally we've missed in bits of urban studies. Okay. So I want to draw a distinction between comparison 1 and comparison 2. So comparison 1 is about comparison from above. So, I've just talked a little bit about the kind of emergence in sociology and anthropology, unevenly in geography, about comparison, the comparison of cities. John Walton's 1973 piece on standardised case comparison lay behind much of the comparative urban studies during the 70s and 80s. In this approach, the selection of the cases was based on the findings and results of previous studies. Whole cities were chosen on the basis of what was already known about them. So cities needed to be rendered knowable before they were considered comparable. So data on cities needed to be collected, analysed, made accessible and publishable in a form that created the preconditions for comparison. Where this revealed certain shared features or similarities, then cases, the cities in question, were deemed appropriate for comparison. And of course, this had an effect of some cities being rendered not able to be compared, or in Jennifer Robinson's terms, off the map. It tended to stifle the comparative imagination, as only cities that were understood to be known, knowable and similar tended to be compared. And this, we could argue, was intellectually and politically debilitating. Charles Tilley's work in the mid-80s reflected and was part of an advancement on this. He had fourfold typology of comparative strategies: individualising, universalising, variation finding and encompassing. So a different way of categorising cities, more nuanced than what had come before, but very much still about the academic as expert, the academic choosing which cities to compare on on the basis of what is known. So while the case for the incapacity of conventional comparative method is able to be fully articulate and open to a world of cities has already been made convincingly and persuasively made by Jennifer Robinson and others, I would argue another manoeuvre is also necessary. So again, the traditional way of thinking about comparison in urban studies, we can think about it as comparison 1, it's about comparison from above. It shares certain characteristics. Not all forms of comparison were like this. And this is not me saying this kind of work is still not valuable. And actually, if you read some US political science journals, this form of comparison between cities in the US and even further afield tends still to dominate and is very fruitful and useful and generates some interesting insights. But again, comparison is about difference and similarity. Cities often the bounded territory, i.e. it's the kind of unit of analysis that's pre-given rather than open up for exploration. And part of the city often stands in for the whole. That may be the centre, maybe a part of the city. The waterfront stands in for the whole of Edinburgh, would be another example. So I want to argue, and I've argued before, and I'll probably argue again, to think about comparison 2, from below and through. So for me, this is a different intellectual project that runs alongside. I guess where I get into debates with colleagues is when they want to push their argument and suggest that my argument is somehow less valid. Anyway, thinking comparatively about cities in the 21st century, I think might require us to think about comparisons from below and through. From below in the sense of being open to the diversity and the multiplicity of either specific elements or whole cities against which other cities or bits of them compare themselves. This involves uncovering the processes and the practices in and through which certain cities or bits thereof are brought forward as places against which other cities should benchmark themselves, sometimes quite literally. And this, of course, means that some cities or bits there are pushed back. Implicit in this mode of comparison is a set of power geometries in which some cities are situated as places from which others should learn through comparison, while others are located as those for whom comparison should involve seeking to learn and often emulate from others. Here we are to understand learning in a broad sense as a diverse and internally heterogeneous field in which a variety of policy expertise, knowledge and understanding, fully and part formed, complete and incomplete. Thinking about following through in the sense of being open to the diversity and the multiplicity of ways, the actual practices in and through which comparison occurs, involving a variety of sites and spaces. This means uncovering the comparative architecture comprising the circulations, connections and networks and webs which shape how cities are imagined and planned, financed and governed, and the diversity of urban contexts, current, past and even future, upon which those making urban policy draw. So again, my case of Edinburgh is about a set of affect and emotion experiences about what the future might be. It's about buying into a vision of the future that then mobilises people and makes kind of concrete decisions around finance that are actually tapping into people's belief systems. So this is about the future playing a role in structuring the present. So implicit in this mode of comparison is a methodological manoeuvre that acknowledges the reconfiguring of what is understood as the urban. That is, holding on to cities as territorial expressions while also understanding contemporary cities as multiplex, comprised of elements of relationships that stretch far beyond their boundaries, to quote Asher, Min and Stephen Graham. Understanding the city as a set of spaces where diverse ranges of relational webs coalesce, interconnect and fragment. This approach to theorising the urban holds in productive tension the interrelationship between relational and territorial geographies and is generative. It produces an understanding of the city that acknowledges all contemporary expressions of territory are, to varying degrees, punctuated by and orchestrated through a myriad of trans-territorial networks and relational webs of connectivity, to quote Gordon MacLeod and Martin Jones. This understanding and what it means to think through comparison from below and through matters, I would also argue, methodologically. Specifically involves considering how to trace and retrace people, policies, and even places. That is to go back over and revisit the ways in which those different elements of comparison are enacted or performed. The emphasis on the ways in which cities compare themselves and the means through which they seek to learn from one another requires an understanding of the activities of those involved. That is, those who produce, circulate, mediate and translate, modify, legitimise and consume policies through their daily work and practice in quite ordinary and mundane ways, as well as the spectacular ways. So a certain global class of analysts, consultant and practitioner continue to be involved in the envisioning of city futures around the world, but also involved are a class of more ordinary policymakers, many of whom are located in the public sector, whose role is often no less important than that of their mobile associates. Okay, and so the work, for example, of Wendy Lana and Nina Laurie about middling technocrats is useful in this sense, to think about the different kind of actors that are involved in these kind of acts of comparison. It's not just the high-profile speakers that are jetting around the world, but actually there are more micro, ordinary ways in which cities are brought into comparison with other cities, with a consequence for the ways in which those cities' futures are imagined. We can also add into the mix, and I say they're important from the beginning, is those activists, NGO representatives and others in the third sector who themselves are engaged in various comparative acts and practices, often to generate alternative visions for the future of the cities in which they are located, retracing their movements, and often, if you can, accompanying them is something that I think we need to be attuned to, but also to think about the accompanying documents, plans, presentations and models. That draws attention to the multiple practices and sites involved in the comparative circulations and connections between cities. And here one can draw upon George Marcus's work, anthropological work about following, which is interesting, I think. Jane Jacobs' work, where she talks about the project of multi-site ethnographies being there and there and there, has helped show how global effects, be they experienced as repetition or difference, are produced by connected trans-socialities of various kinds. Also, the anthropologists Shaw and Wright have written a lot about the anthropology of policy. They talk about studying through the methodological manoeuvre to accompany the mode of comparison from below and through is to move away from studying up or studying down as traditionally been the way in social science. Instead, the move is towards following the source of a policy, its discourses, prescriptions and programs, through to those affected by the policy. That's a quote from Waddell. This involves tracing connections. So the approach is often about tracing and retracing, laying bare the comparisons at play between those cities in and through which an urban policy is circulated, and interrogating how it's evolved, mutated and transformed on its travels. And I could say a little bit more about that, but I'm not going too much more. So while the emphasis is on tracing and retracing, that is the researching after events, conversations, exchanging visits have occurred through semi-structured interviews, minutes or reports, there's also scope to follow quite literally, which implies a degree of real-time participation, of being present. To accompany a study tour, as I have, or participate at a conference or a seminar, sitting on a meeting, as a form of ethnographic inquiry, offers a possibility of going some way to revealing the social life of policies. They might also allay a series of concerns that have been expressed within this emerging field, those nicely articulated by Jane Jacobs when she notes a tendency for scholarship to stay fixated on policy presences, following what has already arrived and formed. So some of the work I've been doing in Australia has been looking about absences. So then there are different kinds of absences in the world of policy. There are those absences that are absences because policy has not been discussed, and there are those absences that are there because policy has been discussed and decisions have been made not to introduce it. To try and get at the notion that absences and presences are relational constructs rather than absolutes. And she makes the case for greater attention to teaching and learning events. And so some work actually that Ian Cook, who's here, I talked about earlier, and I did about the potential introduction of business improvement districts into Swedish cities is one example, which examine the role of a conference, broadly understood as a temporary event that brings together people from particular epicenic communities for face-to-face interaction, and looked at the role of that conference. Okay, so that's the kind of, if you like, the intellectual pitch for this kind of way of thinking about comparison. Comparison to, it's not about comparison from above, it's not about me as an academic deciding which cities to compare, but actually it's about choosing a starting point and following the kinds of ways in which cities who are seeking to make decisions about their future compare in themselves. I'm now going to switch back to a little bit about Edinburgh. So faced with yet another failed attempt to develop its waterfront, Edinburgh City Council felt it had to do something. In partnership with others, it continued to believe in the potential of this waterfront. With rising land values in the centre of the city, it saw the waterfront as delivering on three fronts. First, in the form of generating employment for local communities. Second, in the form of delivering new housing stock for local communities and for others that are experiencing further gentrification. And third, in the form of economically incorporating the waterfront into the city centre. So this is partly a story that Edinburgh was telling to multiple stakeholders about its place in the world, which was, could it find a way of securing a slice or a bigger slice of the kind of financial capital that's moved around the world that it wants to anchor in its waterfront. This was hoped to reduce the pressure on land values in the centre and lead to an increase in land values in the areas to the north, including the waterfront. However, the previous use of the land as a dock meant that potential developers and investors faced a series of upfront costs. Tracts of land needed to be cleaned up and decontaminated, the costs of which were not insurmountable. Accessing sections of the waterfront was also not easy. So there was a need to introduce some basic infrastructure in the form of pavements and roads. So there was some clean-up and some pavements and roads that need to be introduced. Although they were not new costs, the onset of the global recession at the end of 2007 and 2008 brought them into sharp relief. So my initial plan was actually to do field work about the master planning of the waterfront. It wasn't about finance, it wasn't about financial models, but it became quite clear, having gone there to do that kind of work, you actually find yourself dragged into a different set of conversation, a different set of actors with financiers and lawyers about the ways in which finance underpins these deals, or these redevelopments. So, as developers and investors became increasingly risk averse, they wanted others to make the first move to do some of the infrastructural groundwork. As one of the documents at the time noted, while the physical redevelopment of this area is largely the responsibility of Forth Ports, who own it, it's been recognised that the sheer scale, nature and complexity of the regeneration effort requires the support and cooperation of the public sector, particularly in current market conditions. Edinburgh City Council knew it needed to do something in order to kickstart the redevelopment of the waterfront. Its own financial situation, of course, was made worse because of the combination of the recession and the onset of what became eventually the coalition's austerity programme. Borrowing money in the traditional manner was not an option then, and neither was redirecting money from elsewhere in the council's budget, because basically it was facing cuts in its budget. The City Council needed to find a way of paying for the infrastructure without drawing upon its current resources. In this economic financial context, tax increment financing seemed attractive. I'm not going to get into lots of tax increment finance as a financial model. What it allows you to do basically is to draw a line around an area, believe that if you invest in some money in that area, the value of that land will go up, and thus the taxes you pay on that land will go up. So in the case of Edinburgh, it wanted to borrow, actually I don't know what's the conversion rate, 12 kroner to a pound? 85 million pounds it wanted to borrow in order to kickstart the redevelopment. It didn't have it any other way, so what it did was, it was planning to draw a line around this area, say to someone, lend us 85 million pounds, and then we'll use the uplift, the extra tax, to pay down that debt. So it's a way of speculating on future growth. Now, of course, if that future growth does not emerge, you are left with a debt that you need to pay down, and it will have to come off local taxes. And so there are a number of examples in the US cities where they've borrowed the money to build something, the growth has not happened, and that cities in the US that are already struggling financially have been left with even a larger amount of debt. Anyway, that's the model, and I'm happy to answer questions on it. At its basic, it's quite a simple idea. It gets much more complicated when you speak to lawyers and financiers about how that risk is allocated, for example. First used in California in the 1950s, tax increment financing has subsequently been basically the most widely used local program in the US for financing economic development. Edinburgh City Council came to know about TIF through a variety of sources. This is not an example of a model, a policy emerging somewhere and then just moving seamlessly across space. The council had commissioned a consultancy, international consultancy, KPMG, to do some work for it, unrelated to TIF. When the consultancy heard that the council were exploring the potential for using TIF on the waterfront, the company inserted itself into discussions. At the same time as a number of UK-wide organisations lobbying on behalf of the property sector were campaigning about the UK government introducing a range of ways that would allow redevelopment to be easier in the context of the recession. So a range of stakeholder groups representing the interests of property were there lobbying on behalf of a number of models, and TIF was one of them. They were lobbying that the UK government should introduce tax increment financing to allow the redevelopment sector to grow, because during the recession, of course, redevelopment had kind of almost stopped. A number of documents were produced. Each explored the potential of one or more of the policies, including TIF, for financing redevelopment, comparing the plight of the largest UK cities with cities elsewhere in the world, primarily but not exclusively in the US. This included various technologies of comparison, such as figures, graphs and tables, and the use of a range of numerical data. In addition to these documents that were produced and circulated amongst redevelopment professionals, a number of seminars and workshops took place, mostly but not exclusively in London. These discussed the basics of TIF, its successes in the US, particularly in California and Chicago, and how it might be used in the UK. The financial, legal and planning systems in the two countries were compared, alongside the autonomy of cities within these systems. Some events involved speakers from the US attending and speaking about projects in which they'd been involved. These were not elite and high-profile gurus on it, however, but rather the series of middling-ranked technocrats, of which are written about by Lana and Loria. So stories from afar were brought closer to home, complex and complicated multi-million and billion-dollar projects made comparable through the translation work of consultants, governments, officers and planners. So Edinburgh commissioned KPMG, based on its previous work, to partner with it to produce an initial study on the potential applicability of using TIF on the waterfront. The most significant outcome this stage was the rescaling back of the initial plans. So concerns over the complexity of using TIF on the waterfront led to a downsizing the redevelopment project. So here we have an example of the way in which financing actually determines redevelopment rather than redevelopment looking at finance. The next step was to work up a full business case around the 3 key infrastructure projects. During the preparation of the business case, a small number of people in Edinburgh City Council visited the US. The council had already spoken to state officials in California who were over in the UK attending a conference. From this, they became aware of some of the limits of the use of TIF, particularly when it became overused in a particular geographical context, which was the case in California. Although the focus of the visits to the US was not to learn about TIF, it's for another reason, nevertheless, these visits to these policymakers were bolted on. Through this example of policy tourism, they felt they got a better understanding of the policy through speaking face to face with those who have been using it for a number of years. They compared their experiences of working with the pilot in the UK, in the UK's highly centralised financial, legal and planning system, with the more decentralised system in the US. Upon returning to Edinburgh, those involved were able to share their experiences with others participating and make a plan for this use of TIF. There is also a longer story to be told about the ways in which TIF had actually been discussed in the UK from the 1990s, all of which are underpinned by actors and practitioners and activists in housing professionals learning from and speaking about how it has been used in the US and the capacity for it to be used in the UK. Some of it very progressive in terms of thinking about it in a particularly kind of enlightened way, others less progressive in terms of the way it's about securing a place in the kind of financial capital markets. And I say I can talk to more about it. Just to give you a couple of quotes from policymakers who went over to Chicago in the 1990s to find out about TIF. So they talk about the whistle-stop tour through the US has left many of us in a state of exhaustion. However, one thing that has stuck out for me is how the Windy City, Chicago, is making great use of tax increment financing. It's a simple idea. When the city designates a regeneration area, it fixes the amount of property taxes, the equivalent of rates, that go into the public coffers. As regeneration proceeds, any increase in tax raised in the regeneration area above this level amount is reinvested. The local regeneration partnership decides what the priorities are. Another quote, a few areas fail and raise nothing. A few areas raise more than they can ever be reinvested and wound up early. The others continue for many years. One of the beauties of it is that private lenders will invest capital at the beginning and take their returns from the tax increments. This investment in itself funds the buildings which generate the taxes to repay the loans. Clever, and it works. Okay. So the waterfront plan, the financial plan, was signed off by the Scottish Government at the end of 2010. It consisted of 4 elements: a new link road, a public esplanade, new finger pier and new lock gates. Because actually what happened over the course of the period was it became less about housing and about job growth in this master plan and more about trying to get more of the kind of share of cruise liners, the cruise line industry, to come to Edinburgh and spend their money. So that's why you needed a new link road, a public esplanade, new finger pier and new lock gate. It's a fairly ordinary, mundane bits of infrastructure that would allow this bit of the Edinburgh to grow. This would cost 84 million. Serving to, in quote, unlock 660 million of private investment, including 60 million in new infrastructure. The executive summary of this business plan made direct reference to the experience of using TIF in the US. So it quotes, TIF has been widely used in the US to support and deliver regeneration and economic growth over the last 30 years, with nearly every state enacting TIF legislation. While there are clear differences between the public sector in the US and Scotland, TIF could provide the means to deliver infrastructure and better economic growth by paying for growth with growth. However, this is not an example of the unproblematic movement and introduction of a policy, far from it. There were months of long and drawn-out negotiations between different landowners and other interested parties. The model that appeared to work in Chicago and elsewhere in the US, but also now in Canada and is about to be introduced into Australia, required translating into a policy in line with the UK's existing financial, legal and planning systems. This took time. It wasn't quick, it wasn't fast. Establishing a governance structure and management framework to accommodate the interests of all stakeholders, particularly in relation to the dispersal of risk, proved challenging. Just like when it looked like an agreement would be signed off and the UK's first tax increment financing district would be established, in June 2011, the company that owned the chunk of land was bought by an infrastructure fund. One of their first acts was to sell the retail complex. All of a sudden, a number of the assumptions on which the TIF business plan rested no longer were in place. Negotiations with the new owners needed to begin over, and as of early 2015, or March 2015, there's still not a tax increment financing district in Edinburgh. Okay. And there's just some, not as nice as the examples of the photographs from Emma this morning, but photographs of what the waterfront looks like now, which is a combination of some limited residential development that took place in the 1990s and 2000s, a bit out on a limb, and there's not much social infrastructure around it, like shops and doctors and schools. They're a bit out on the limb. There's lots of green, run-down kind of area. Some of the community groups have tried to take ownership of this, actually into custodians to manage it, and the council have kind of pushed back by putting up these barricades around it. And there's obviously a little bit of port activity that's still going on. So the lecturer has made the case for an alternative mode of city-to-city comparison. It argued for an approach that rejects the tendency for much of the past work on comparative urban studies to select city cases from above. That is on the basis of already known similarities across a number of whole cities. Resting on the premise that many contemporary cities are constituted through territorial expressions of connections and networks, a similarly unbounded methodological manoeuvre involves comparison from below and through. In this, the attention shifts to actually existing comparisons as practiced by those who make urban policy. It turns to connections and circulations that go some way to constituting contemporary cities, but also to the disconnections, to the uncertainty, to the incrementality, and the unpredictability of trying to make policy. More specifically, to the various comparative acts that are undertaken by those policymakers involved in assembling their own urban policies, and by extension in shaping the future of their own cities. And in doing this, actually what you do is open up the range of actors that are seen as somehow mattering in the making of urban policy. So it's not just those that are elected, for example, maybe not just those in the business sector, maybe not just those in community groups, but you get about other actors who also have a say in the way in which cities develop and emerge. And I mean, for me, the most startling thing is the role of people in the finance sector, the legal sector, now increasingly playing a role, particularly in contexts where you have city government not having the financial expertise to oversee the complexity of some of these financial deals. So you have to automatically bring in someone from outside. So you get a kind of another way of thinking about the shadow state in terms of the making of policy. So consultants, think tanks and others. The example of tax increment financing reveals the ways in which those involved in the waterfront compared it to various cities, notably Chicago. It was there that the experimenting of the City Council recast an internationally relatively well-travelled policy into something that would catch the attention of policymakers from elsewhere in the world. It's become something of a model for financing urban redevelopment, at least in the UK, and while it's yet to be introduced into Edinburgh, its presence as one of a number of options facing UK urban policymakers speaks to how those leading UK cities are being increasingly required to speculate on their future urban developments. So on one hand, this is about continuity with the past, for cities in many different national contexts have always speculated on their futures. But it's also about, in part, a new decision-making matrix in which finance plays an increasingly central role in making decisions that then matter to the citizens of cities. Thank you.